Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the English Daily Book Summary YouTube channel. In order to not stop learning, listen to an English book summary every day for free.
Wolfgang Münchau, Kaput, the end of the German miracle. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Germany set about rebuilding its shattered economy into what became a global powerhouse. This process came to be known as the country's Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle. It was fueled by a focus on industrial manufacturing, and, for decades, it seemed that the good times would never end. But today, cracks are quickly spreading through the system's foundations. Factories are struggling to stay competitive, and policymakers remain stuck in outdated 20th century economic thinking. As a result, there's a growing concern that the very system once credited with creating Europe's strongest economy may now be threatening its future. How did things go so wrong? And can the world's third largest economy reinvent itself before it's too late? This blink traces the story of Germany's economy over the past half-century. You'll discover how an obsession with exports left the economy vulnerable to globalization, and why leaders doubled down on failing policies. You'll also get a glimpse of what it might take for Germany to reverse course and reclaim its economic strength. But first, to understand the roots of the miracle and the rot setting in, we begin in Mülheim, a small town where Germany's past and future collide. Let's get started. Neo-mercantilism's fatal flaw. In the German industrial town of Mülheim, two factories used to stand side by side. One made pipelines, the other nuclear reactors. This was the economic backdrop to author Wolfgang Münchau's childhood. These factories weren't just employers, they were monuments to the post-war economic model that rebuilt Germany, a model admired and emulated around the world. But today, that very model is showing signs of collapse. How did a system once hailed for its strength unravel so dramatically? The answer lies in Germany's embrace of neo-mercantilism, an economic ideology that treats global trade as a zero-sum game, placing export dominance above domestic growth. For Germany, this policy hinged on two factors, the first of which was deliberately underpaying its workers. The logic was that by keeping wages low, they could sell German goods for cheaper abroad. The second factor was to use state-owned banks to subsidize industrial titans with huge loans. This allowed them to outproduce rivals abroad. Taken together, these enabled Germany to amass huge trade surpluses, exporting more to the world than it imported in return. So, how did this play out in practice? Enter the Landesbanken, regional state-owned banks tasked with enforcing industrial policy. Rather than reward innovation, these banks channeled capital into politically favored sectors. A telling example came in the 1990s when steelmaker Krupp announced its merger with rival Hirsch. The deal was facilitated by Westdeutsches Landesbank, WestLB, which, under pressure from politicians in Düsseldorf, waived standard credit checks altogether. This wasn't an exception, it was the system. The bank's boardrooms were stacked with union leaders and political loyalists, creating a self-reinforcing loop. Subsidized loans preserved jobs in legacy industries, which in turn secured votes and political backing. Unsurprisingly, WestLB earned the nickname Red Godfather in financial circles. But the very structure that made this model resilient in the 20th century became its undoing in the 21st. As the global economy evolved, two fatal contradictions began to surface in Germany's economic playbook. First, globalization demanded agility, something the Landesbanken, conditioned to follow political orders rather than market signals, couldn't provide. Their blind plunge into US subprime mortgage investments ended in disaster, with an €18 billion collapse after the 2008 financial crisis. Institutions built to resist market forces found they couldn't survive them. Second, while Germany's massive 8% GDP surplus came from exports, cars, machinery, chemicals, the profits were repeatedly funneled back into the same aging industries. This created a closed loop, prioritizing sales over innovation and stunting long-term growth. And so we arrive at the reckoning. Neo-mercantilism's central failure was clinging to industrial models of the past, even as the world pivoted toward digital transformation. Today, those rigid structures are colliding head-on with a fast-moving global economy. In the next section, we'll examine how this rigidity has transformed Germany from a post-war innovation pioneer into a nation now scrambling to keep pace with its own digital decline. Digital alienation. For many, it's a hard fact to stomach. The nation that once rewrote the rules of technological progress is now sabotaging its own future at every turn. In many ways, it's quite ironic. From the printing press to the diesel engine, German ingenuity helped give birth to the very modernity it now systematically rejects. Yet, as the 20th century gave way to the digital age, Germany's institutions, once the proud architects of industrial capitalism, began unraveling their own legacy. And this shift wasn't accidental. While there's no single point when Germany's trajectory shifted, 1973 marked a turning point. This was when Chancellor Willy Brandt had a committee draw up visionary plans for a nationwide fiber optic network, infrastructure that could have placed Germany at the forefront of European digitalization. But in 1982, Helmut Kohl shelved the project, championing high-definition analog television instead. These deep-seated preferences tie in with what we saw in the last section. By foregoing digital in favor of analog, Kohl hoped to strengthen existing manufacturing capacities rather than embrace potentially disruptive technologies. This preference quickly turned into a pattern. In the 1990s, a senior Siemens executive is said to have dismissed mobile phones as those little devices that people carry. Instead, the company hedged their bets on analog telephone exchanges, technology that would soon be confined to museums. As the world raced into the new millennium, Germany's technophobia only increased. The dot-com crash of 2000 hit the country's digital industry hard, with its tech-heavy Neue Markt index plummeting by 96% between March 2000 and October 2002. But while the American tech sector rebounded to build contemporary giants like Amazon and Google, Germany took a different route. The country's economic elite concluded that digital was dangerous and instead doubled down on analog. One industry where this misjudgment is particularly evident is in the country's famed automobile sector. For example, when California threatened to impose EV quotas in the late 1990s, Mercedes started to develop an electric A-Class compact. When California backed down, Mercedes shelved the project. Ironically, the security components developed within the project would later be used by Tesla. This reluctance to embrace all things digital extended far beyond the auto industry. By 2021, 70% of German households still access the internet via outdated copper wiring, resulting in notoriously slow speeds. A photographer came up with a creative way to demonstrate this digital bottleneck by comparing two methods of getting 4.5 gigabytes of photos to a printer 10 kilometers away. One via upload and one via horseback. The horse won decisively. Even after returning and feeding the animal, the upload still hadn't finished. As software continues to outpace hardware in terms of value creation, Germany's industrial-heavy economic model is being pushed to the brink. But the threat isn't only from within. While the country resisted digital transformation, it was also entrenching itself in an energy partnership that would one day threaten to hold its entire industrial future hostage. The Russia energy trap. The roots of Germany's reliance on Russian energy stretches back much further than Vladimir Putin's rise to power. Its genesis lies in Chancellor Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, his attempt to thaw relations with the USSR by increasing economic cooperation. In 1970, this diplomatic push led to two nations signing a historic natural gas deal. The idea was that by connecting Soviet gas fields to German industry, the USSR might soften their politics. and at the same time, cheap gas would help keep German industrial exports affordable. This strategy reached its peak after the fall of the Berlin Wall with Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. During his tenure from 1998 to 2005, Schröder infamously forged a deep friendship with a recently elected Putin. He even celebrated Christmas at the Russian leader's home in 2001. Then, barely weeks after leaving office, Schröder ascended to the chairmanship of Nord Stream AG, the consortium building gas pipelines from Russia to Germany. By the 2010s, it had become completely normal for German politicians to champion their energy ties with Russia. Frank-Walter Steinmeier, now the country's president, famously downplayed concerns about Russian aggression during his stint as foreign minister under the Merkel administration. And under economics minister Sigmar Gabriel's tenure from 2012 to 2018, Germany's reliance on Russian gas jumped from 35% to 55%. Even Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 did little to change the minds of decision-makers in Berlin. Then, in February 2022, everything changed. Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, and Germany was finally forced to face the music. But while debates raged in Berlin on how the country would survive if Russia turned off the taps, another political decision was coming back to haunt them. This was Merkel's 2011 plan to phase out all nuclear reactors by 2023, a decision made in the wake of the Fukushima disaster. The last reactor was to go offline in April 2023. How would the country keep the lights on? On one side, economists calculated that Germany could survive without Russian gas, but they'd take a 3% GDP hit. Chancellor Olaf Scholz sided with industrial leaders instead. They insisted that this wasn't a price Germany could afford to pay. The debate ended abruptly on September 26, 2022, when explosions destroyed the Nord Stream pipelines. Overnight, steel giant ThyssenKrupp slashed steel production by 25%, BASF closed down their ammonia plants, and Germany raced to construct LNG terminals to replace the lost gas supplies. The catch was that this alternative source of energy would come at 3 times the cost. The era of cheap fuel for Germany's insatiable industrial machine had come to an abrupt end. What ensued was an energy crisis born out of a fatal trade-off at the core of the country's economic model: industrial competitiveness purchased with geopolitical vulnerability. But Russia wasn't the only problematic relationship they'd nurtured for years. The Berlin-Beijing axis was also beginning to sour. The Berlin-Beijing axis. In the 1970s, as Brandt pursued Ostpolitik with Moscow, cooperation with China was dismissed as a sack of rice falling over in Beijing. Today, that same indifference has metastasized into complex supply chain dependencies, with some German industries now entirely dependent on Beijing. The story began after President Nixon's landmark visit to China in 1972, which opened the door to global trade with the once isolated nation. But while other Western powers moved quickly, German policymakers were slow to act. It wasn't until the 1980s that serious engagement began, most notably when Volkswagen established its first joint venture in Shanghai. Today, China stands as VW's largest and most important market. Then, as the 1990s rolled in, just-in-time manufacturing began to transform global industrial relations. German firms hopped on the bandwagon, outsourcing parts production to China en masse and reorganizing their supply chains. For the time being, Germany clearly dominated the relationship. After all, it was still exporting machines and plant-building expertise to China. In return, Germans benefited from cheap consumer goods. In 2014, the Sino-German relationship reached its peak, with President Xi Jinping arriving in Duisburg with the China Railway Express. The reason for his visit? To name the city the European terminus of China's Belt and Road Initiative. It was now normal for German political figures at every level to embrace all things China. Mayors, trade officials, and former government ministers became China advocates left, right, and center, all working towards the greater goal of facilitating market access for German industries. But it wasn't long before cracks started to appear. China's dominance in Germany's solar panel sector, achieved by undercutting domestic producers with cheap imports, marked a turning point. German firms operating in China were now having to confront mandatory technology sharing and joint venture demands, restrictions absent for Chinese companies in Germany. The power dynamic had quietly inverted, and China now held the upper hand. By 2022, things were getting out of hand, and fast. German exports to China increased by only 3%, while imports from China leapt by 34%. What's more is that Chinese suppliers now controlled over 80% of Germany's imports in 36 critical industrial sectors. And how did German industry respond? By doubling down, of course. BASF pledged the construction of a €10 billion chemical plant in China. At the same time, CEO Martin Brudermüller acknowledged that if China attacked Taiwan, a scenario almost certain to force Germany into full economic decoupling, the company faced total financial collapse. The myth of balance reliance, that China depended on Germany equally, now lies in tatters. The question now facing German industry is one with no easy answer. Do they continue their dependence on a strategic competitor, or endure the certainty of economic pain from decoupling? While German corporate lobbyists are still advocating for the former, the writing is on the wall. China has successfully exploited Germany's vulnerabilities, mirroring Russia's tactics with cheap gas. But while Russia controls only one input, China now has a stranglehold on Germany's entire production chain. End of an era. It now seems undeniable. Germany has reached the limits of its post-war economic model. It's not much of an exaggeration to say that the country is literally starting to come apart at the seams. Signs of fragmentation are visible everywhere, from the country's crumbling road and rail network to the hollowing out of its mainstream political parties. A closer look reveals a nation caught in a downward spiral of decline. German bridges are a great case in point. Following years of diverting investment to industrial expansion instead of critical infrastructure, a key autobahn south of Dortmund was closed indefinitely after engineers discovered one bridge at risk of sudden collapse. Things went from bad to worse after subsequent inspections showed all 60 bridges along the corridor required urgent repairs. As of early 2025, the route has been closed for 4 years. And near Cologne, a bridge on one of the country's busiest routes was completely closed to trucks in 2016. 8 long years and countless massive traffic jams later, the bridge finally reopened to truck traffic in 2024. Things aren't much better when it comes to German politics. Frustration at the inertia of the country's largest mainstream parties, the CDU and SPD, have voters flocking to the extreme right. The far-right AfD, or Alternative for Germany, solidified its base after the 2015 refugee crisis, and now commands nearly a quarter of the electorate. Commentators say that if the mainstream parties don't get their act together, the AfD will be in pole position to come first in the 2029 general election. Amid this political upheaval, Olaf Scholz's coalition took power in 2021 with promises to tackle Germany's economic woes head-on. The new government announced a €450 billion modernization program, with particular funding earmarked for digital infrastructure and green energy, but then a series of crises struck. We've already gone over the 2022 Ukraine invasion, which was then compounded by months of political wrangling over unpopular heating reform. Then, the top court ruled that the entire modernization package violated Germany's austere fiscal rules, leading to the program's abandonment. These setbacks show that there's an urgent need for Berlin to embrace bold ideas to reform its economic policies. The author provides suggestions that, if implemented, could reverse Germany's fate before it's too late. A top priority should be creating a unified European financial system with shared government-backed bonds. This would force German banks to stop endlessly funding failing industries like coal plants and outdated factories. Equally important is reforming the country's constitutional debt brake that limits its deficit to 0.35% of GDP. For too long, this rule has blocked critical repairs to infrastructure and slowed the vital process of digitalization. Together, these steps would free up money for investment in digital industries while rebuilding roads, rails, and energy grids. But time is of the essence. Germany's entire identity remains tied to an industrial model that no longer works, and this system is vanishing without a successor in sight. In this blink to Kaput by Wolfgang Münchau, you've seen how Germany's post-war economic model, once a global symbol of industrial strength, is now unraveling under the weight of its own contradictions. The very systems that once powered the country's rise are now accelerating its decline. State institutions continue to prop up legacy industries. Digital innovation is met with skepticism, and deep dependencies on Russian energy and Chinese manufacturing have backfired dramatically. The fallout is visible across the country, from crumbling bridges and sluggish internet speeds to a growing surge in far-right political support. The message is clear. The time for Germany to change course is now. To regain its footing, the country must align more closely with Europe and invest in building a unified, tech-driven economy. If it continues to cling to its export-heavy past, it risks watching its global influence erode, until, eventually, it disappears altogether. Okay, that's it for this blink. We hope you enjoyed it. If you can, please take the time to leave us a rating. We always appreciate your feedback. See you in the next blink.